And we're doing bad morning news again. So a bad morning to y'all. It is the 19th of July, 2018. And with any luck, this should be a very good episode. There's been a bunch of stuff coming out on Russia. For those of you who don't know, this show is going to be essentially the antidote to your butter yellow couch morning news pablum. It's going to be designed to get you pissed off at the way things are and aimed at the way things should be. So feel free to tune in to this every day and make sure to shoot up your workplace. So let's get, I guess, straight into introductions. We're talking with Lupinit here, who will introduce himself shortly. Some housekeeping. If you are interested in becoming an anchor and you're good at being at regular, like you've got 1 day a week or 5 days a week that you could come in at this general time frame, let me know and we'll get you set up with the Discord server that I'm going to set up for staff today. So this will be a paid position. Eventually, we'll be able to fund ourselves, but I'm going to need y'all's help with that. So if you're interested, I have a patreon.com/insanity is free that will be funding the show's staff once I get a certain threshold over my current level of patrons. So feel free to go check that out. And feel free to check out any of the links in the description. This is brought to you by Brave, the ad-resistant, tracker-resistant web browsing experience, which supports creators directly through the basic attention token system. It's also brought to you by Cash App, which is a Federal Reserve note and Bitcoin wallet designed to make it easy to spend those sorts of things. They give you a little Visa card. And if you send $5, they'll send me $5 and you $5 back. So consider doing that. Also consider getting a Liberty mug, mugs that you can use to piss off your coworkers while also shooting up the workplace. So feel free to download any of those things or use any of the services in the description there. The more people do that, the higher likelihood I can keep doing this. So I thank you all for doing that who have already done that. And without further ado, let's get into this particular episode of Bad Morning News by introducing Lupinit so he can introduce himself, let people know where people can find him. We'll be doing a lot less of this sort of stuff next week. I just wanted to establish this for people who've been long-time viewers of my existing channel. So, and once we get to about 25 episodes, I'll be transitioning this sort of like this show to that new channel. So expect to be able to sub to Bad Morning News on YouTube. But with that being said, why don't you introduce yourself? Let people know where you can be found and what you do.
Hey everybody, I'm Lupinate. You can find me on Minds and Discord as Lupinate or on Steemit as Anarchic Wolf. I usually write about reality, voluntarism, and a lot of things around logic. And trying to teach people that seems to be a very important part of what I'm trying to do for everybody. And I think given the recent stuff going on with Putin and Trump, logic has gone out the window. So let's have a look at that, shall we, today?
Yeah. So you had a story from Hal Turner radio show?
Oh yeah. That one's I don't know how accurate this is, everybody, to start with. It's potentially true. I kind of hope it is, because it would explain a lot. But yeah, from the Hal Turner radio show, for U.S. National News, dear God, they caught them all. Putin gives Trump 160 terabytes of communication intercepts, all people behind fake Russia collusion, false flag chemical attacks in Syria, sabotage of Brexit, nefarious Clinton activities, and more. So, yeah, it looks like Russia may have dropped an info bomb on the president that he may have had, he may not have had it, and at least now if he does have it, it can be used legally. So that should be fun. Anyway, thanks to my longtime former colleagues from the intelligence community, whom I worked with in my years with the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, from both inside and outside the US, I am pleased to be the only media outlet to be able to report this extraordinary information. The jig is finally up. The dominoes are all in position to be knocked over. The elite have phoned, faxed, and emailed many of themselves right into prison or worse. When the public finds out, probably worse. At the meeting in Helsinki, Finland, between Presidents Putin of Russia and Trump of the USA, the Russians gave to Trump at least 160 terabytes of Russian intelligence intercepts, which expose horrifying activities of many, many people to deliberately foment social, cultural, and political chaos, violent riots, demonstrations, media smears, phony scandals, and fake news. Some of those intercepts reveal who has been financing weapons, supplies, travel, hotel, vehicle rentals, and secure communications gear for terrorist groups inside Syria, Iraq, and terror attacks in Europe and the US. Among the intercepted communications are mostly international phone calls, faxes, emails by members of the U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate, federal judges, state-level elected officials from California, Oregon, Washington, New York City, and state, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia. One of those communications left the United States. Once those communications left the United States, it became fair game for any country to spy on. A great number of those communications were encrypted, but Russia has found a way to break much of the encryption. And as part of their efforts to improve relationships with Trump, they provided the original encrypted versions of the intercepts and the key which decrypts them, so the U.S. can use the U.S.-obtained intercepts, which may still be encrypted, along with the Russian-provided decryption key to prove this info is accurate and unedited. So let me just take a breather there, because it gets a lot more in depth as it goes along. To be honest, there is loads of information to take it down here, but I think to start with, yeah, if this is true, and God, do I hope it is, then dominoes are going to start falling soon. The actual people behind the scenes are going to be really wringing their hands, and it does explain a lot of the outcry over the meeting itself, I think. What do you think, Jeremiah?
I mean, okay, so you know me, I'm a conspiracy guy. I think that if it does explain the hand wringing adequately, that it's because this sort of thing is something that they've been planning for a while. Either some of them or all of them have planned to make this work the way it did. Because, let's be real, I talked relatively recently about hanging things around undesirable people's necks. I talked about throwing people under the bus. I talked about how that sort of happens in bureaucracy sometimes. So maybe if they are cleaning house, they're just cleaning it so that it can be a better functioning machine. And then combine with the fact that if you want to prove that a manufactured divide is not manufactured to the satisfaction of the majority of the people, maybe make it seem like Trump is actually draining the swamp when he's in fact enriching the swamp, which has been proven time and time again. There are plenty of videos where you can just find on YouTube that Trump is the swamp. Some of them are, mildly racist, like this one where the dude is just he spends I want to say fucking 4 to 5 minutes just listing the Jews that Trump works with, but a lot of the other videos aren't, and it should be obvious to anybody paying attention that all of this is just designed to get us to stop focusing on essentially the line items for the Bilderberg group this year, for G7, for NATO, for the SCO, fucking all of these organizations meeting in the same time should be a much bigger red flag to most people than all this data coming out. But I'd be pleasantly surprised if this wasn't corrupt. I just don't think I'll find that out.
Well, I can continue a bit, because it does damn quite a large amount of the world with within this 100 60 TB worth of data. Numerous high-ranking officials and well-known wealthy people have been caught red-handed scheming together and with foreign governments, along with radical leftist billionaires, both inside and outside the U.S., to foment and finance extraordinary acts of political, social, and cultural chaos, including riots, violent attacks, political unrest, and more. Some high-level managers at gigantic social media companies have received literally millions of dollars in payoffs to establish or use under-the-radar company policies to impose severe censorship on certain views and to silence certain people, oftentimes without the knowledge or consent of the highest executives or boards of directors of those companies. These payoffs usurp actual executive power in some giant social media outlets. High-level mass media producers, editors, and some writers in the US, UK, and elsewhere in Europe have been paid off with vast sums of money to launch phony media smears, push scandals, create and report fake news stories, all to sow dissent, foment unrest, cause political and social instability. When this information is revealed, major, like really major, news outlets will be completely ruined. Their company stock or that of their parent company will plummet to zero because their credibility, their believability will be utterly destroyed. Ad revenues will plummet because the people simply not trust these outlets anymore. And let's be fair, we're kind of seeing that with CNN right now.
Well, I mean, and I get that, but CNN's been going downhill for a longer time than this. I mean, CNN's been
definitely
going downhill ever since they started cucking for Obama, like, and with their own core audience. No, I mean, because they were against Bush, and they seemed like they were going to be against the power structure, and that they were a stable, somewhat fair news source under Bush. But then Obama comes in and they can't do anything but like lick the inside of his asshole. So I mean,
I get why you say that under Bush. I see why you say that under Bush, but I do remember Jon Stewart lambasting them for getting shit wrong even during Bush's time.
Well,
he had a lot of fun with CNN, and he's had a lot of fun with CNN for decades.
Of course, his primary beef with CNN is that their primary, like, actual ethical host needs to constantly throw it to people who are like fun and exciting and getting people like on board. He said like fucking that Larry King and Anderson Cooper were the only two like reasonable hosts, and that the rest of them could basically go fuck themselves. That's what his contention was, because he didn't see the rest of the people there as serious news. He saw them as essentially fluff pieces or corporate mouthpieces. And he wasn't too far off, you know. But that's like, they lost credibility when they became fluff pieces and mouthpieces, and that started largely under the Obama administration. Like, especially since they were really experimenting with a lot of those like fucking subliminal bullshit things, like where they use those colors and those moving circles to get you to think what they want you to think, you know. Fucking programming your brain to think that this is legitimate, and that's why everything's moving so quickly and moving in so many cycles and getting the parts of your brain that are used to absorbing, but whatever, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. But I think to be honest, the amount of data that I want people to just for a second imagine every DVD you probably ever watched. Yeah, let's say you have 400 DVDs. Yeah, you could probably burn all of those and fill up maybe a 4 terabyte hard drive, and that would give you days worth of footage and evidence to watch. Basically, you'd be able to do a lot with that. Now imagine that times 40, and that's how much data Trump now has to play with, if this is true. And
right,
that is insane. The number of man hours just to go through that much data is incredible. So, I mean, to me, that is.
I agree.
I mean, that much is on its own is huge. Whether or not any of it's relevant is a different story.
Well, and I agree. But at the same time, I think that it's wise to remember that even if they have this data, there's very little likelihood with it. I mean, having data doesn't mean that you're going to look through that data or that you're going to do anything with your findings. I mean, ultimately, you still need an accountable organization there to prevent that data from being misconstrued, prevent that data from being tampered with. And a lot of these agencies are sort of like Hillary, and deleting massive amounts of data is something that they do regularly. I mean, they make jokes about paper shredders, they make jokes about document incinerators, but those are
True,
real, and those things
true,
happen.
but remember, this is coming from a foreign government as well, so there's backup copy somewhere. And
Well,
if it doesn't go live, there's no reason why Russia couldn't just slowly drip feed it to the world. They may not believe Russia, but at least they could drip feed.
right. Well, but keep in mind, it came from a foreign country that's been heavily involved in the news recently. If you wanted to craft a narrative, there's no better way to do it, especially since the average person doesn't need to be able to see these documents. They just need to share the news story, the quote news story that claims that these documents exist. The average person actually doesn't know that these documents are real. So
very true. But like I said, the narrative on what is going on with Putin and Trump is quite one-sided in the US, I think. But around the rest of the world, it is a bit more balanced because people recognize the fact that you don't settle policy decisions in the middle of a public announcement or public interview with reporters. That's just foolish. And people go on. I mean, there's a number of things that could be done to mitigate any of that. It's just a matter of understanding reality and how statecraft actually works.
Well, and is there any more to the piece that you were reading from?
There's the brief blurbs on how it's implied that Brexit was muddled with by these same groups, and so is the Clintons and the rest of it. I mean, it to be quite frank, if you follow any of the independent media, you've probably heard all of this once at least before, particularly if you follow things like Zero Hedge. But it's basically just confirming everything that all the conspiracies were saying is true from a data perspective, potentially, provided this obviously isn't fake news.
Well, on that level, since it doesn't sound like there are many more facts in the possible facts in the piece that you've already been reading from, let me start on this piece from antiwar.com that I was going to read yesterday, but then we just got into the fuck the police mentality. So this is from David Stockman at antiwar.com. The Vlad and Donald Show, a glorious blow for peace. The Vlad and Donald show in Helsinki Monday was simply brilliant and breathtaking. We'd say even a beautiful thing to behold. Between them, they left CNN's nattering nabals of neocon nonsense sounding like the shrieking monkeys they actually are. And that's to say nothing of the fools they made out of the newly minted liberal and progressive warmongers on the Dem side of the aisle in Washington, or the so-called journalists who fill 90% of the space in the so-called mainstream media with endless pro-war propaganda. But most of all, it was the single greatest blow to the war party since it turned imperial, Washington into a colossal menace bent on global hegemony when the Soviet Union slithered off the pages of history in 1991. We have said all along that Putin and Russia have been demonized because the warfare state desperately needs an enemy to justify its $800 billion annual mugging of American taxpayers. Yet today's spontaneous chorus by the two leaders in behalf of détente, dialogue, and diplomacy puts the kibosh on that big lie more completely than could 100 TED Talks or a year's worth of pro-peace op-eds in the Washington Post. So flyover America will have no trouble seeing the good of the Helsinki summit. Trump and Putin just killed it on every topic, where the war party and its shills in the press want to drive a wedge. That is to say, cooperation on Syria, arms control, terrorism, North Korea, Ukraine, friendly competition on supplying natural gas to Europe, an invitation to Mueller to send his legal sleuths to Russia to participate in the interrogation of the 12 GRU ham sandwiches named in the indictment, and best of all, a reciprocal notion that Russian prosecutors come here to question deep state operatives about how they helped one of the greatest scoundrels of modern times, Bill Browder, abscond from Russia with about 1.5 billion skimmed from its people, and on which he and his posse paid zero taxes either here or there. Indeed, the debunking of the false mainstream narrative about Russia's nefarious intentions and doings was so complete that the deep state apparatchiks were reduced to sputtering hysterically. For instance, here is the bile issued by the central architect of the Russian collusion lie, former CIA Director John Brennan. Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises to exceed the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous. Not only were Trump's comments imbecilic, he is wholly in the pocket of Putin. Republican patriots, where are you? Then again, when you actually read the transcript of the joint press conference, you'll find the very words, phrases, and tonalities that harken back to the courageous efforts of liberal Democrats like Senators George McGovern and Frank Church, and even President Jimmy Carter, to promote diplomacy and détente during the height of the Cold War confrontation, when each side had 9,000 nuclear warheads on hair trigger alert. And exactly what was John Brennan doing circa 1976? Well, he voted for the communist candidate for president, Gus Hall, because he thought Jimmy Carter was too much of a Cold Warrior. In other words, the guy's a demented partisan hack who arose to power during a 25-year career in the CIA that began in 1980, and during which he sold his soul to the warfare state in pursuit of position, power, and pelf. But beyond our joy in hearing the gaskets popping all over the Imperial City, we can say this: the course of that press conference and the Donald threw down the gauntlet to the deep state in a manner so explicit and unequivocal that there is now no turning back. Either he will rally the undoubtedly dazed GOP troops on Capitol Hill and his base in behalf of reapproachment with Russia and an end to Washington's arrogant imperial hegemony, or they will indeed put him back on the Dick Nixon Memorial helicopter for a final ride to Gonzville. And at this point, we're at a loss. 50 years of studying the imperial city notwithstanding, to know which way it'll go. But we have no doubt that the deep state and its shills, assigns and nomenclatura throughout the imperial city will now escalate their war against the Donald to red-hot intensity. So there's more to this piece, and I would recommend people read it. But like antiwar.com doesn't necessarily endorse the president. They've been posting a lot of pieces on how when he starts talking about peace with another country, there's a huge chorus of people that are against that idea. So it's interesting to watch the press try and justify pro-war mentalities when they've been anti-war for like since Bush. Theoretically, like the anti-war left is just gone, and that means they were never really there to begin with.
I don't think they ever were. I think the last time the anti-war left existed was Vietnam, to be quite frank, and that was a good 40 years ago. It hasn't been really back ever since. It's been quietly sitting on the sidelines, pulling patriotism as much as possible.
Well, care to elaborate on that?
Well, look at the past 30 years or so, okay? When I was a kid, after the wall fell, basically, and I do vaguely remember that as a very young child, seeing that it was a very important thing that everybody was fascinated with. I mean, I just thought it was a bunch of people climbing on top of a wall, and I thought, that's neat. And then I saw them knocking it down and thinking, they're not safe on top of that thing. And that was all I remembered. But the majority of wars since then have all been empathy wars. They've all been, oh, look, there's somebody who needs help because some other group's invading them, or there's communism somewhere that is being run by a dictator. and that dictator needs to be stopped. That's been basically the rule since 1986, roughly. Iraq 1 was started off falsely. Iraq 2 started off falsely. Bosnia is a shit show. The Afghani wars were, again, a shit show. It's basically let's take over the Taliban's opium fields. The Syrian war, everybody is now fairly clued up on that Assad didn't start this. It was largely CIA funding rebel-backed sympathizers that then went to al-Nusra Front or ISIS. In fact, most of them went to ISIS, and the whole ISIS thing is unfortunately in the same boat. And there's nothing that one can say that justifies war apart from protecting somebody else. And that's why they've tried these empathy wars. But the only way they can do it is lie. And all of these companies, from Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, they always go lockstep behind the concept of a major war if somebody is in danger. Just look at the track record. Even they've done that since Vietnam, at least, if not earlier. You could make the argument for things like the Lusitania being that, or Pearl Harbor being that, if you really try.
Well, and you know, on those levels, like if you look at the fact that like essentially purple was decoded well in time to prevent Pearl Harbor, and if you look at the fact that the intel was there to prevent 9/11 and just quote couldn't be passed interagency, there's a huge amount of evidence that could be suggested that these things were directly done so that they could lie us into war.
Exactly. And I mean, just look at Brennan on his own track record. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, he was the CIA head that rubber stamped the people who did apparently commit the 9/11 attacks. If the main story is to be believed, he's responsible for allowing them into the country.
Well, right. Yeah. And of course, you know, on that sort of level, the CIA was initially responsible for radicalizing the group of Mujahideen that would eventually, you know,
Become Al-Qaeda.
metastasize into Al Qaeda, Al Nusra, and ISIS. So, and whatever else the permutation, like, because it always mutates and then permutates into, you know, a huge amount of other organizations so that they can pick and choose which one seems to be the scariest seeming that they can justify their wars with. So, like, if it's not ISIS in a month, it'll be something else in a month. I'll put it that way. So then, looks like Daniel got dropped. That's unfortunate. I guess Google's messing with this show too. You know, I kind of thought that maybe it would be less interrupted in this sort of way if we had less guests, but I guess Google just drops people randomly from these calls, and I guess they have very little desire on getting these sorts of things in order, because this has been happening for a while. Like I do regular hangouts on air, and a lot of these hangouts on air are interrupted by Google dropping people from the call, just like dropping them. So I'm gonna message him on Discord and get him back into this call. But then he's got a piece that he posted from the Independent, and that's ignore the calls of treason. Trump handled the press conference well, or something like that. It stops at conference. So let me get him back in here, and we'll get this show back on the road. But yeah, I mean, the elites are always going to lie, and try and get people into war because it's one of their most profitable industries. And when they do, they always make sure to make it seem like there's a bipartisan idea here, so that they can avoid thinking the American public thinking that it's only one or the other. But when they do get the American public to think that it's one or the other, it's usually because they want to prevent certain parties from coming off the reservation, proverbially speaking, and it might be that in this case. Welcome back. I don't know why Google is such a bag of dicks to this
That might have
particular
been my
show.
network connection.
I mean, maybe it did
I've had-
sound kind of choppy earlier, so I thought it might be that.
Yeah, I had to turn off my Wi-Fi on my phone and rely on my mobile signal at the moment.
Gotcha. All right. Well, you were saying, and like after you get done saying what you were saying, you've got a piece from the Independent that you could take a look at, and then I'll read the piece that we discussed pre-show, and we'll discuss that a little bit.
Fair enough. I mean, my main point is you should trust people who don't lie to you. And unfortunately, most of these media networks that are established and supported by the state and Google and all of these other institutions are lying to us. They have been lying to us for years. And it's only now that we can prove it categorically that they have been lying to us for years. So now that we can prove this, they're obviously getting loads of backing saying they're the only reputable news source, and anybody saying otherwise is a racist, misogynist, homophobe who obviously wants to eat babies. It's one of those sorts of extreme circumstances that isn't true because they're very good at lying.
Yeah. Well, and they make a decent chunk of change from lying. Like all these news organizations, the more clicks they get, the more viewers they have, the better their Nielsen ranking is, the more they can justify making huge amounts of money on advertising. And that's really what it is. All these corporate news outlets are just ad agencies.
Circle gets the square. Bingo. This is how all of it works. Advertising is the core. The more eyeballs you have on the screen, the more value you add to the ad network. The more likely advertisers will spend those $1 million budgets, and yes, that is how big they are, on you. And the honest truth is most of those companies have not seen huge online sales growth because they've seen it grow in comparison to their subscription content, obviously, but because they're lying all the time, their views have gone down, especially compared to the YouTube bloggers out there like Sargon and Paul Joseph Watson, or even Philip DeFranco. These people are popular because they present their own version of the news that is usually a bit more balanced or is actually logical rather than nonsense, which tends to be what comes out of the liberal mainstream media now.
Yeah, well, and also, of course, those outlets, they accept comments and critiques from the public, whereas the closest CNN and Fox News and all these mainstream entrenched outlets get to that is like reading some tweets on air that agree with the position they're trying to present.
Oh, of course, you got to add bias and you got to add confirmation bias to the bias so that your bias sounds more realistically true.
Right. You know, and I'm probably going to lose some viewers for saying this, but it's in my Twitter bio, so fuck it. You know, this is why the media didn't like Gamergate. This is why the media panned Gamergate as the idea of you know, hateful, misogynistic people, you know, beating on women, because they would rather do that than encounter the fact that there was this mass movement against the idea of corrupt journalism, and this group of people had an idea of corruption that was very behind the curtain. There was like a Google group called Game Journo Pros where they could see behind the curtain and see people's screenshots from that group and see, hey, these people were manufacturing stories, and the competing news outlets that we thought were competing were actually talking to each other to try and manufacture prevailing thought. And that sort of thing happens with other media as well. Media outlets don't compete nearly as much as people think they do. And that's the reason I supported Gamergate, not just because I'm a gamer and I collect Chaos Emeralds, but because I understood that it was maybe a good way to get people interested. See, we lost 2 viewers, to get people interested in looking behind the curtain in that sort of way. And if they are looking behind the curtain, they're going to see like a den of filth that they've never seen before, because they were never considering it in this sort of way.
See, I didn't get involved in Gamergate because I didn't really understand it when it was going on. I don't read anything from game journos because I like to make my own opinions up about games rather than rely on somebody else's. Because there have been times when I've missed out on a great game because I read somebody's opinion of it and they basically lambasted the thing. And then years later, when I tried it, I really would enjoy it. And it was usually stupid fun, but at least it was fun. So I've stopped relying on game journalism to determine what is a good game and what isn't. And
right. Well, and that's the thing. Like the left got to say that all these people were misogynists, even though there was no demonstrable misogyny, because that's the way the left operates. They just accuse somebody of being one of their evilists, and well, I mean, at least the mainstream left. There are plenty of leftists I know who don't do that. Accuse somebody of being an ist in order to avoid like actually discussing what they're discussing, but. Like, and that's what they're doing here. They're calling people a traitor for saying maybe we shouldn't go to war with Russia. Isn't that fucking insane? Like, what's more treasonous than getting American deaths to be your top priority, than getting people's, casualties in a foreign conflict to be the #1 thing on your agenda? Like, that should be the last option, not the first option. But everybody seems to think that peace with Russia is cucking to the enemy. At least everybody in the neoconservative and neoliberal circles that run the mainstream media outlets. So it's pretty. And then like, even if it's not a neocon or a neolib, and it's something like Fox News, where essentially the only perspective you're going to get is a pro-Trump perspective. It's all possibly there to strengthen the elites.
You gotta understand though, mate. War sells papers. Death sells papers.
I mean, I do understand that. Like, the idea is to sell, but the idea is to sell based on a manufactured divide, and the corporations love it. Coke's willing to advertise on Fox News and CNN, right along Fox News's fucking, self-lubricating catheter ads, and CNN's like osteoporosis medication ad. They're willing to, run a Coke ad or two, or an ad for like, EA Sports or whatever. It's all benefiting the same people fundamentally, and everybody knows it at least somewhat. It's a big club and you ain't in it, as Carlin would say.
Yep, very true. Well, let's hit that next article.
Yeah, so that was The Independent you had?
All right, give me a second. I'll see if I can pull that one up quickly.
And yeah, I was right. We lost 3 viewers of what we had. We had 4 viewers, and then just fucking. So and that's one of the things I get the feeling that when I start talking about like. Oh yeah. Okay. So, and also let me address one of the people that's been here since the start. I think. He asked if I had heard of any good open source alternatives for Hangouts, and I said Discord is pretty good, so is Slack, on which Discord is based. And he said, oh, okay, apparently Signal also has voice chat. Well, yes, it does have voice chat, but it also means that you need to give your phone number. And so I'm not going to give my phone number to just anyone. I give it to Lupinit here, but I wouldn't give it to just anyone. And that's also an international call, so it probably, like for some people, has greater costs. I would rather just use the internet personally.
You should always try and stick to a data transfer system at the moment. It's usually going to be cheaper and you have more access and bandwidth that way.
Right. I
Plus, you
mean,
can then do share screen and stuff like that if you really wanted to. Um,
right,
which
and I
may be
think
something we need to do for a later one.
right, and I think Telegram has voice chat as well, if I remember correctly.
Mm,
And I have that account. And also, there are plenty of like I could just Skype it, but all of these things would require that Wi-Fi adapter I also mentioned in chat. So if anybody wants to fund that Wi-Fi adapter, this will get immediately better. But
mm.
for now, this is what we're working with, unfortunately, because Google is a big bag of cocks.
Don't get me started on Google at the moment. Even their social network is buggy as hell today.
Oh
Right,
yeah,
let's focus on the Independent, though, because
yeah.
apparently in their voices section, and I'm only going to read a part of this so we don't get hit for any kind of content infringement, but ignore the calls of treason. Trump handled the press conference with Putin well. Here's why. Those on Trump's own side who had opposed the meeting from the start were dead set against any improvement in US-Russian relations and went to great lengths to preempt the very possibility. If you thought President Donald Trump's non-state visit to the UK was a slow-motion car crash, albeit one that played out amidst flawless pageantry, consider his tryst in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin. The final press conference had scarcely begun when his critics launched in their tirade on social media, accusing the US president of weakness, even surrender, in the face of an all-conquering Russian adversary. Then it got worse. Answering a question about whether he believed the assertions of US intelligence agencies or the denials of Putin about alleged Russian interference in the US election, Trump said he didn't see, quote, any reason why it would be, quote, Russia. That is more or less the answer he has always given. Whether he was wise to give it while sharing the stage with the Russian president, of course, is another matter. Even Russian reporters are said to have been aghast that the US president was prepared, in effect, to question the reliability of his own intelligence services in that way. Was there no nuanced reply he could have given that would have left, at very least, a degree of ambiguity such that his integrity, as he would see it, and the honor of the agencies could both remain intact? A skilled spin doctor would have surely devised one. But of course, Trump does not do nuance, and there is no love lost between him and the Washington establishment that he believed is out to get him. Nonetheless, by the time Air Force One touched down in Washington, and the charges of surrender had become treachery, treason, and undermining the national interest, the president was persuaded, or potentially strong-armed, to revisit his remarks and give something akin to the answer he should have given in the first place. How many hours his staff had spent scouring the transcript to find the minimal change that could be made to save Trump from himself will probably be never known. But the result was a fairly contrite president saying this in a key sentence. In my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia. He also added a muffled and qualified acceptance of Russian meddling in the 2016 election and expressed full faith and support in the U.S. intelligence agencies. It may be just enough for new critics on his own side, who included some of his longtime friends at Fox News, to call the dogs off. It may also help to reduce the potential harm to the Republicans' cause in this year's midterm congressional elections, which probably is the main aim. It will do nothing, however, to change the minds of his domestic enemies. Rabid opposition at home, or rather in Washington, was why the Trump-Putin meeting in Helsinki was always going to be a bigger risk for the U.S. president than for his Russian counterpart, and it so proved. For all the warnings about Putin's 20 years as a KGB agent, such as his supposed mastery at reading, quote, the enemy, his dominance of post-Soviet politics, and his near 2 decades of experience on the world stage, these were not the reasons why Trump emerged from Helsinki, the apparent loser. Putin did not, in the event, run rings around Trump in Finland, nor did he outsmart Trump at the public podium, nor did he inveigle him to make concessions, either on sanctions or on the Ukraine, or, so far as we know, anything else. No, it was not Putin who bested the U.S. president at Helsinki, but those on Trump's own side, who had opposed the meeting from the start, were dead set against any improvement in U.S.-Russian relations and went to great lengths to preempt the responsibility. Now, I'm going to stop there because there is a bit more to this article, to be honest, quite a bit more to this article, but that gives the long and the short of it, effectively, from my perspective. Trump shouldn't have basically gone back on what he said, from my perspective as well. There have been countless incidents where US intelligence has come up with a nothing burger that supposedly existed and then suddenly doesn't in actuality. Think the WMDs. It was one of the biggest scandals in both the UK and the US that we went to war over something that never existed. And that principle also then applied to Syria. It also applied to a number of other incidents in the world. And Putin has usually been on the opposite side of that in a number of occasions, particularly on every single incident in Syria. It's caused a lot of diplomatic friction. And it's important to recognize that fact and to give these people something to be worried about. Because you can't keep lying to everybody and expect them to constantly believe you.
Apologies, I was answering questions in the chat. So yeah, and let me end this today by reading this thing, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Let me read this thing from the Free Thought Project again, which, by the way, everybody check out the Free Thought Project. I cannot emphasize that enough. Them, the Activist Post, Corbett Report, TruthStream Media, and antiwar.com are all sites that I automatically tweet. And so I get all this news basically in my notifications when people like my posts. But I also really appreciate what they do. And that's the reason that even though I might not always... oh, and the Fifth Column News as well. Shit, I forgot them.
Not now.
Yeah. Fucking... Because I've actually written 3 pieces for them. So I shouldn't have forgotten them, but whatever. Hey, fucking Justin, if you're listening, welcome to the show. But beyond all that, this piece says, as Americans argue over Russia, U.S. government quietly allows dark money groups to keep donors secret. The U.S. government will no longer force dark money groups or certain tax-exempt organizations to disclose their financial donors. While politicians and mainstream media outlets obsess over President Trump's recent press conference with Russian President Putin, the U.S. the fucking U.S. Treasury quietly announced that it will no longer force dark money groups or certain tax-exempt organizations to disclose their financial donors. While traditional charity groups must still disclose donors in order to receive tax-exempt donations, the change allows labor unions, nonprofit, and issue advocacy groups to be free from being forced to adhere to confidential disclosure requirements. In a statement praising the new rule, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said Americans shouldn't be required to send the IRS information that it doesn't need to effectively enforce our tax laws, and the IRS simply does not need tax returns with donor names and addresses to do its job in this area. Mnuchin attempted to paint the shift as a good thing by claiming that it is important to emphasize that this change will in no way limit transparency. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell insisted that the new rules will keep Americans from being bullied for exercising their First Amendment rights, alleging that individuals could be fired from their jobs or bullied if their political donations are made public. However, Senator John Tester argued that we need more transparency in our campaigns, not less, and he views the rules change as unacceptable in the description of, quote, Washington at its worst. While some politicians have gone as far as to praise this move as a, quote, win for privacy, they are also applauding a change that will allow them to be less transparent with their constituents. As a report from Reuters noted, the change protects the privacy of wealthy donors of dark money donations to politically active groups. These dark money groups include organizations such as the National Rifle Association, Planned Parenthood, and the Koch brothers Americans for Prosperity, and George Soros' Open Society Foundation. The announcement from the Treasury came on the same day that a Russian woman named Marina Butina was arrested and charged with conspiracy to act as an agent for the Russian Federation by building ties with the NRA and other political organizations. Senator Ron Wyden criticized the timing of the move on Twitter and claimed that the Treasury has made it easier for the anonymous foreign donors to funnel dark money into nonprofits the same day a Russian national leader linked to the NRA was arrested for trying to influence our elections. No matter an individual's political stance of beliefs on whether or not the Russian government tried to influence the 2016 election, the fact that the U.S. federal government appears to be acting in favor of these dark money donors is incredibly troubling. However, even though the U.S. Treasury has essentially approved election meddling through secret financial donations, the mainstream media's focus has remained on whether Trump should have met one-on-one with Putin and on the 12 Russian officers who were indicted for alleged hacking, even though there is no proof that their actions were sponsored by the Russian government. American taxpayers deserve to know who their elected officials are being funded by, and while it is not likely that those representatives will ever wear NASCAR jackets with the names of their sponsors and corporate interests, it is disturbing that the federal government is moving to protect dark money donors against the interests of transparency.
Yep, that is worrying. One of the big improvements in the electoral system was the requirement to disclose all funding. And now that that is no longer an option, it means that we've got even less accountability available for our politicians, lobbyists, bureaucrats within them. So all we have now is basically a big black hole of information so that we can't see what is influencing the means of the state. And these types of things will probably have to be done through FOIA requests and things like that, which will mean that it's even longer and we'll need to go through the court system and all sorts of stuff. So, yeah, from a from a legislative point of view, this is horrible because we've got no way of knowing what's actually influencing the creation of a law.
Well, and ultimately, we don't have really an idea anyway, because you can always funnel it from place to place. And nobody's going to make the big string corkboard that, would make them look terrible to their relatives if they came over. So, I mean...
Nobody wants to look like a conspiracy theorist with the massive corkboard on the back. That meme is just classic to represent what would need to be done to work out the connections here.
Yeah, well, and, there are people like me who have owned the label conspiracy theorist and sort of like, oh yeah, I am a conspiracy theorist, what's it to you? But like a large amount of people aren't willing to look behind the curtain in this sort of way. Like, and that's the reason, because this sort of divide can happen, and it's going to make easier access to the elections for Democrats too. People always forget that a Democrat is going to be in office someday, and then after that Democrat is in office, the Democrats will forget that a Republican will be in office someday, and all the powers that they agreed were fine will suddenly be,
no longer fine.
Yeah, well, yeah, and so it's really easy to see that there's a whole lot of problem here with not a whole lot of easy solutions. But people just want that easy solution. They're craving an easy solution in the same way that there's an easy solution to everything else. That's why all these subscription services exist now, because essentially people are fine with being treated like cattle as long as the farmers bring them the food right up to their doorstep.
I personally don't have a problem with the technological improvements of things like food delivery or things of that nature, simply because it means that people then have more time to do something more beneficial to their surroundings and to the rest of society.
Well,
it frees up time. Well, it does. It does free up time. Think about it. If you have to drive,
Netflix.
Well, potentially, yes, potentially. I'm not saying that it doesn't mean that they have more free time to spend on entertainment endeavors, but at the same time, that freedom allows me the ability to do things like this to some extent, because I don't have to worry about the deliveries. I can schedule them. I can make them fit my life cycle rather than somebody else's.
Yeah.
The convenience is something people don't appreciate properly, mate. It's something that I'm quite concerned with in a way, because people will say convenience is a bad thing. No, that's not true. It's a very good thing. It's what you do with the time that matters.
But see, most people don't even say it's a bad thing. Most people don't say it's a bad or good thing. They just like not having to work as hard. And as a result, they're not thinking about using their time for fundamentally changing the world like you and I are thinking about possibly doing, even though this show might never do that.
Well, we got to see what the market says.
Well, right.
I like to think that because. Sorry, mate. Go on.
Go ahead.
Basically, I like to think that there is a market for long form discussion, because if there wasn't, this won't have a chance of working. Jordan Peterson wouldn't have a chance of working. That phenomenon wouldn't work. All of these phenomenons where people are doing a discussion with somebody who is knowledgeable about a given situation, that's important because it gives people information they can digest while they're doing something else.
Well, right, and that makes sense. I'm saying that a lot of people don't. I mean,
oh yeah,
even in terms of that, like there are countless hours of these videos being uploaded to YouTube, and most people aren't watching these videos. They're watching like the latest Rice Gum feud. You know?
Oh, I know.
They're watching the Paul brothers or Tanacon or FouseyTube or, Keemstar. They're watching those things because it's easier to digest than this.
Of course it is.
And that's the same thing with the subscriptions, man. Like, you can use it to do something like this, and so can I, even though I don't typically. I'm fine with going for a walk. But, like, most people aren't going to use these subscription things and, this ease of access and this convenience. They're not going to use it for, doing something good with the time that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. They're going to use it to make it easier to relax once they're off work, once they're off being a cog in the machine.
Yeah, potentially. I'm not going to deny that. But at the same time, there are people like us who will use the time more efficiently. Yeah, and but the fact is, by having those... I know, but by having those people being more efficient with their time and being able to do more, that then acts as an example for other people to follow. Right. And lead by example is something that I am very supportive of, because if people don't see how you can be and be successfully, that is completely non-violent, non-aggressive, you can't work with a system that creates that if you're used to a system that uses the opposite, that uses aggression to force a reality upon everybody. If you can forge your own reality, if you can forge your own way of life forward, not cause conflict in the process, that's the best way you can live. And it's not something that many people understand.
Right. Well, and so let me read a few comments from chat, and I think that'd be a good place to wrap this up for today. Carr says they weren't really accountable before, they're just not trying anymore. And I agree with that. Like, most people, especially in the news media, especially in politics, and it translates down to the people that support those people, they're not actually moving against the machine in any given way. And Finian's comment ties in to that relatively well. Comments anyway. He says, I try to use my free time to read, to learn, etc. Sometimes I need a mental break though, so I play a game like DayZ Standalone. I agree. I'm an avid Chaos Emerald collector, so that's what I do with my time.
I mean, for me, I tend to do a lot of reading or research with my spare time, particularly for things like this and for other things that I'm getting involved with and for my own works. But at the same time, I do have a tendency to blow off steam if I'm stressed by playing video games. That said, I haven't done that for a couple of weeks. I've been too busy doing research and sorting my own life out.
Well, and my video game time lately, because my controller's broken, and has been for a bit, has been spent like basically instead of doing what I would have previously done and playing some games, I've been outside and doing Kali drills with Kali sticks. So I've been getting much better, physically speaking. I'm about to have like an actual pack of abs for the first time in my life. That's gonna be interesting. Fucking, he
And
continues.
that's an achievement for any American.
Yeah, exactly. Fucking carbo loaded America. And then Finian says, yeah, they don't care because they're not starving yet. It's not their home being bombed or their children being murdered. We're like the Ron Paul, though, in Congress. There are so few of us that the oligarchs can just ignore us. We don't have the numbers to make any significant changes. I would qualify I would qualify that with a yet.
Yeah, I was about to say exactly the same thing. I don't think it's that far off because I've seen a lot of things that have come out of places like Nam and Hong Kong and things like that.
Off, but at the same time, I'm willing to accept the likelihood that people are possibly getting upset enough.
Well, that's why we're here doing this.
Yeah. So, but anyway, thanks to everybody who was here and stuck through even when I was talking about evil things like Gamergate. So, to anybody who's new, please feel free to subscribe, like, comment, share, blah blah, hit the bell, bop it, twist it, shove it in a light socket, and shoot up your workplace. This has been Bad Morning News with Jeremiah and Finian, and I guess this is signing off this episode. Be well, everyone. No, sorry, not Finian. Sorry, looping it. See, I told you the caffeine hadn't quite kicked in yet. Fucking. All right, with Jeremiah looping it. I was reading the fucking comments. The comments. Fucking.
I know. Hey, it happens, mate.
Yeah, fucking verbal slip. Fucking. Anyway, and honestly though, if this thing gets off the ground and I can start paying a staff, I'd love to get Finian on board. Because he's been a stable voice in Shit Shooting Sunday and Real News Wednesday as well. So,
very true.
Yeah. But anyway, we'll see y'all tomorrow, same time, same channel. Looks like this is about wrapping it up. Be well, everybody. Have a bad morning.
Bad morning to you all, guys.